I'm Scott Sherman. I'm going to talk about fair dice. So I'll start out with my definition I'll say a die is fair if each value has an equal chance of being rolled. And my phrasing will become important later. So first off, everybody's familiar with cubes. The first time I really paid attention to platonic solids was many years ago playing D&D, which gives you 4-sided, 6, 8, 12, and 20-sided dice. And then a few years ago, I went back and took a look at where D&D was, and they had these other dice that I hadn't seen before, these 10-sided shapes that weren't platonic solids, but certainly seemed like fair dice. But what were those? Now, some of you are familiar with isohedra as being shapes that make fair dice. Ed Pegg Jr. did his thesis on showing that isohedra make fair dice. So then I wanted to actually make some of these shapes, have them 3D printed. And a lot of these are familiar shapes, platonic solids, Catalan solids, a few others. But there were several of these that just kind of, I reached dead ends. So Google led me to isohedra. This is a page from Math World. But then when I tried to look at some of the shapes in more depth, so there was one, the tetragonal, pentangle, dodecahedron, nice mouthful. But Google didn't seem to know anything further about this shape besides just this picture, which wasn't quite enough information. And so then I had to try to reverse engineer from the pictures, because if Google doesn't know it, well, nobody knows it. Obviously, the wisdom has been lost somewhere. And then another shape here, the pentagonal icosatetrahedron, which is a specific shape. It's the dual of the Archimedean solid, the snub cube. But it turns out that as a class of isohedra, it's actually part of an infinite family with 2 degrees of freedom, as was that other shape that I showed you earlier. Here I'm just showing you some transformations along one dimension. But you can see that there are actually a whole family of interesting shapes here that make for fair dice. And intuitively, you can think of the isohedra as polyhedra, where each face is, has the same relationship to the center of gravity as all the other shapes. But then naturally, I wanted to know, well, what other shapes make fair dice? Joseph showed one off a couple days ago that was his twist on an isohedra. But are there other shapes that make fair dice? Well, just looking around, there's teetotums, dreidels, barrels, crystal dice. These all make fair dice, but they're not isohedra. So what shapes are these? So again, Google wasn't informative, didn't help me find out if anyone had a name for these sorts of things before. But I explored a little bit more and made some other types of dice. So the one in the upper left corner has 4 sides that come up with equal probability. Again, not isohedral. I have that jack in the upper right corner where it's kind of a star shape. Each of the 5 shapes, I was hoping maybe someone would have a solution. That each of the 5 numbers would come up with equal probability, and then a couple other shapes. So I coined the phrase, the term polyisohedron, which is equivalent to an isohedron, except sets of faces all have the same relationship to the center of gravity. So, for example, that earlier Johnson solid I showed you in the upper left corner there has 4 faces that are squares, 4 faces that are equilateral triangles. And if you group them in sets of 2, each of those sets are equally likely to be rolled. And I have a couple other pictures of polyisohedra as well, one that I turned into a dice. And so the shapes that I showed you earlier that I had printed, and the other shapes, the other dice-like objects that you've probably seen before, can all be classified as polyisohedra that have been symmetrically modified, maybe made curves and other shapes, but they maintain that symmetry so that they still are fair dice, but they're not isohedra. So I have much more written up on my explorations and rediscovery of some of the isohedra and descriptions of the polyisohedra. I also have a wide collection of interesting shapes for dice up on my Shapeways site. And if you just Google Loki 3 and fair dice, you'll find me, because if Google knows about it, then it's true. Thank you.